Hello and welcome to another episode of Awaz-e-Haqiqat, which also stands for the voice of truth. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Malika Bhadra, and depending on whichever part of the world you're listening to me from, today's topic, for some reason, has always been close to my heart. We're going to be talking about not just partition, but the trauma it has always carried with it. How heavy is that word in a sense, literally, metaphorically, and its in an entirety? And on that note, to add more to that conversation, I'm so pleased to have a special guest with me. I am joined by Dr. Ammara Khalid. She, after running a group practice over a decade, has now decided to shift gears and she started her private practice with a new focus. At RIA, her goal is to help clients rediscover and redefine their relationship with themselves and others. Dr. Khalid is also a licensed clinical psychologist in Illinois and in 40 plus states as a PsyPAC member, specializing in individual, couples, and family therapy with children, adolescents, and adults of diverse backgrounds. Dr. Khalid completed her bachelor's degree from New York University and her doctorate in clinical psychology from Illinois School of Professional Psychology in Chicago. She offers therapy, clinical supervision, guest speaking, and consultation services as well. On that note, a very good evening, Dr. Khalid. Thank you for joining me, and how are you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm well. How are you?
Not too bad, thank you. Thank you, and thank you for giving me your time. I'll, I can't contain my curiosity. I'll get straight into it. This whole thing around the partition, we often have the silence around this, whatever happened, right? But how does the silence surrounding the post-forgetting of that incident impact the way the new generations understands their family history?
So, for me personally, partition is very close and dear to my heart. Both the sides of my family migrated during the partition. So, my dad's side migrated from Delhi, and my mother's side migrated from Lucknow. And so, I always grew up knowing a little bit about my history, but not fully understanding the grasping of what it means to be displaced, what it means to leave behind your home. And I think I started to lean into that as I turned 8 and my immediate family, my parents, myself, and my sister moved to Italy for 3 years. And we were there. And then we moved back to Pakistan. And then we moved to Saudi Arabia for 4 years. And then I moved to the US. And I was here on a student visa. And I went to NYU, as you mentioned, and got my doctorate here and have been here for a while. And I actually came here because my grandparents, who had migrated from India to Pakistan, had migrated from Pakistan to the US. And having the opportunity to live with both sets of my grandparents, I lived with my dada and dadi, my paternal grandparents in Pakistan, and my maternal nana and nani here in the US. It gave me a sense of connection to them, and I was obviously curious about family history, being a family therapist myself. And so I started to learn more about their history, more about their stories. And because I speak Urdu and Hindi, I also see a lot of South Asians here, and including South Asian elderly folks who have also been through similar histories and have had that experience of a double migration, right? From India to Pakistan, Pakistan to India, Bangladesh to India,
Yeah.
Pakistan to Bangladesh. And so I started to be interested in these stories and understanding how trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next. And we know that from the field of epigenetics, that just like your temperament, your mood, your physical characteristics, your health characteristics, all of these things can be passed down in your DNA. There's cellular memories that can also be passed on. So, for example, when your grandmother, your maternal grandmother, was 5 months pregnant with your mom, the cell that would become you was in her body. So, whatever your grandmother experienced at 5 months of pregnancy and beyond not only impacts your mom, it also impacts you. And in some ways, that's such a beautiful image, right? Sort of this idea of three beings in one body. But when we think about this generation of folk who went through so much, they saw war, they saw floods, they saw famine, they saw displacement, so much grief and loss. At that time, silence was the only way to survive. It was keep your head down, Do what you need to do because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so they did that. They moved on. And South Asian culture has a lot of beautiful elements to it, but there's a lot of cons too. And especially when we're talking about trauma, mental health issues, there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of silence around it because there's a big degree of shame and there's a big degree of secrecy. So the idea is you carry these secrets because you don't want to think about what will other people say if they were to find out. So there's lots of different layers as to why people chose to remain silent. They carried their pain with a lot of stoicism. And that's part of that generation, the boomer generation. They were raised in a certain way. They didn't have the emotional literacy, the psychological jargon that we have as millennials or Gen Z or Gen Alpha do. And so there's some differences that are, I think, generational. And having a little bit of distance from that time allows us today to say, okay, let's ask more questions. Let's try to understand where this comes from because anxiety and depression can be passed down. Even if you have a really good life and you're moving along and things are going well, there can still be scarcity mindset that you're struggling with. There can still be these legacy burdens that we carry.
Very well said, Mara. Very well said. I think also the timing is important because by the time we realize that something has been hitting us from the past, it could be at any stage of our life. And how do we deal with it? How do we choose to address the grief? We'll probably kind of come to that in a bit, but that also I think is important. Um, you mentioned a bit about family history that can be passed upon the next generation, but how does that trauma or how does that memory of trauma influence modern South Asian views, sorry, on career, marriage, social status, and more importantly, on financial security?
So, trauma can be passed down through our genes, through cellular memory. It can also be passed down through family narratives. It can be passed down in a variety of ways. And according to IFS, which is Internal Family Systems, which is the model that I use in practice, we talk about legacy burdens. And these are sets of beliefs that can be limiting and we carry them in our families, not fully understanding where they come from. And there are four kinds of legacy burdens that we see. So there's racism, there's materialism, there's patriarchy, and there's individualism and collectivism. So I'll talk briefly a little bit about each one, but basically, there were so many rich, diverse cultures in South Asia. I mean, we have people from Rajasthan, we have people from Balochistan, we have people from Sindh, from Punjab, and that's how people define themselves, right? They define themselves regionally, not necessarily as Pakistani or Indian or Bengali. It was more like, oh, we're Punjabi, or, we're from Tamil Nadu and we're Hyderabadi. And so you have a big group of people with their own traditions, cultures, food, music, language, but there were a lot of ethnic clashes between them. And some of them can be attributed to the British divide and rule strategy, but some of the violence was there from the beginning. And so we see this even now, even though the partition I mean, next year will be 80 years, but we see the clashes between different groups now. There's a lot of nationalism, there's a lot of fascism. And I think that the trauma has stayed with us. We have not healed from this trauma, and trauma can beget trauma, right? I mean, I think about the attacks that happened in Kashmir just last year. We see political upheaval across the board, even today in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So there's a lot that we're still carrying, and we haven't really understood the impact of how it's playing out today. So, like I said, racism is one, materialism is another one. And this is a big one for us because I think a lot of South Asians, especially in the diaspora, it's part of that immigrant mentality that you save as much as you can because you don't know what will come tomorrow. Or we live in that scarcity mindset. And scarcity mindset is not just about money. It can be hoarding resources. It can be feeling anxious that, you won't get married and there's not enough people for you to be matched with, or there's not enough financial security and there's not enough. And the antidote to scarcity mindset is having an abundant mindset. So that's the belief that there's enough for everyone, including me, to go around. I can share my resources. And if I don't get something today, it doesn't mean that I failed or that I need to be ashamed, right? So there's all these ways in which it shows up in our lives. Um, Patriarchy is another one, and obviously we know that, South Asian culture, generally speaking, has a lot of rigid gender norms and
Yeah.
roles and expectations. And it's really important to understand where that comes from and what are places in our families where this shows up, because there's a lot of expectation around daughters, or eldest daughters in particular, that they play a very caretaking role, or pressure upon sons to provide for their families.
Yep.
Where do these pressures come from? How are they rooted in gender? And how can we try to create more egalitarian relationships? Because then it impacts marriage, it impacts parenting, it impacts all of these different pieces. And then lastly, there's the tug of war between individualism and collectivism. So that speaks to this idea that we must get through our problems by ourselves. We don't ask for help. We don't shame ourselves or our family by showing weakness or being vulnerable. But part of being a collective is that there's support. And so why don't we reach out to those support systems? Why don't we, I joke with some of my clients who say things like, well, therapy is a Western thing and it's a white thing and it's a this generation thing. But peers and rabbis and molvis and priests and imams, they've been around for centuries, right? There was healing in our communities. There were spaces where we could go and speak to someone, get their guidance, or even elders in our family. But as the families have become smaller, and there's so much distance, especially within the diaspora, we don't have access anymore to those community networks and support systems.
I'll go back to that one thing when you say that there's been movement and all of these like assets or aspects affect how we think through, right? But when we migrate, there's another feature that engulfs us is that I'm a stranger in the stranger country, right? Add on to that is that you're carrying a burden, you're carrying an adage of this trauma. How does that affect me when I'm a migrant in a new place?
So I think immigration trauma is its own beast. And if you are coming from a legacy where there has already been displacement, there has already been trauma, grief and loss of losing family members. In my own family, for example, I still have family members in India that I've never met, because my grandfather had left his siblings behind, and some of them decided not to move. And I don't know if I'll ever get to meet them face to face. And so when we move, we lose some sense of identity, some sense of belonging. We try to adjust to the new culture and all of the norms and expectations, and we sort of have to now negotiate, right? What are things that I want to keep from my own culture? What are things that I maybe want to leave behind? And there's different models who've also addressed this, like models of acculturation, and that talk about the pros and cons of assimilation versus, rejecting the new culture completely, or rejecting your own culture completely. And how can we find sort of a more integrated sense that allows for balance, that allows you to be all of who you are, and recognize that there are pros and cons in the culture that you left behind and also the new culture that you're part of, and giving ourselves the ability to choose, right? I think is hard. And I think a lot of our parents who move to a new culture sometimes have a fear that their children won't practice the same values, that they'll lose their language, they'll lose the culture. And so sometimes they really force their children to be a certain way and adopt certain values. And again, this is something I see often, is that for folks who leave their home country and then never go back, they're kind of stuck in a time capsule, right? If they moved in the 60s, they're stuck in the way India or Pakistan was in the 60s, or they moved in the 70s or 80s. they don't realize that things have changed back home too. And sometimes with folks that I work with in therapy, they'll be describing things and they'll call it culture. And I'm like, wait a minute, is this the actual culture or is this the culture of your family? Is this the way your family practices XYZ tradition? Because that's not always the case. And so sometimes we have to be careful about what is culture and what isn't.
Absolutely, Dr. Khalid. But you also mentioned an important point is preserving our cultures, right? Preserving our language and food and whatnot. Now, when we talk about cultural rituals or songs or food practices, they help us in a way of getting us connected to our roots. But they can also preserve the trauma in a way, right? How does that balance help? Where do we draw the line of a fine balance?
So we have to draw multiple lines, right? When we talk about traditions and values and culture, we can examine them within the four legacy burdens that I described. So if something is rooted in patriarchy, for example, we have to assess, is this working for us or is this harming us? Another example is the idea of closeness versus enmeshment. A lot of people ask me, what does enmeshment look like? What are the behaviors? It's really not about the behaviors, it's about how it makes you feel. It's the impact of that closeness versus enmeshment. So, for example, in collectivist societies like South Asian culture, we tend to have a very different idea of boundaries, right, in our families.
Yeah.
So maybe it is a sense of closeness if you are in touch with your family every day. The the determination of whether something is closeness versus enmeshment happens in how does your family make you feel?
Mm.
So, for example, you could have a group chat and let's say a day goes where, you're busy, other things come up, and you don't respond. Now your family may think, okay, she's busy, she's got something else, and there's no punishment for your silence. Versus a conversation in the group chat where immediately people start asking questions. Are you ignoring me? What's going on? Are you too busy for us? Why have you been so silent? So enmeshment becomes a way of creating control, creating conformity, and that's the way to distinguish between what's healthy and what isn't healthy.
Oh, absolutely. I think, but it's so difficult to distinguish, Dr. Khalid, because people like us who have no idea what is what, how do you tell your clients, like, what are the telltale symptoms of what is closeness and what is enmeshment? How do you distinguish?
It looks different based on culture, based on religion, based on ethnicity, all of these
Mhm.
factors. But the question that I keep reminding folks to ask is, how is this making me feel? Am I actually feeling close? Am I feeling supported? Am I feeling loved? Or is this making me more anxious or maybe more avoidant, where now I start to ignore phone calls and I don't pick up, or I get anxious and I shut down? Those are kinds of things to think about because ideally, you want to have a healthy relationship which is rooted in respect, in reciprocity, which can be challenging for some South Asian families because we tend to be so hierarchical, right? Authority flows very much top down, and that's kind of the parenting model that is generally speaking across South Asian families. But are there ways in which things can shift or change? And so that's where we have to kind of assess how adaptable or flexible are the unspoken rules and roles in our own families.
Absolutely.
By having some of these difficult conversations,
Yeah.
we find out sometimes there's no room to question anyone, to ask questions, to challenge anything, right? It's like, this is the status quo, this is how we were raised, this is how we're raising you, end of discussion. There's not much room there, right? There's not much flexibility. Whereas parents who are like, okay, let me try to understand where you're coming from, um, there can be room, there can be curiosity. And I think for a lot of my young adults, I remind them, like, if you start to criticize your parents, they'll shut down. But if you start by asking questions, come from a place of no judgment, just curiosity, and ask them, why do you think this is important? Were your parents like this with you? What do you think they could have done differently? Is there anything you think they could have done differently to understand your experience better? How can we make our relationship better? I think that carries a very different tone than you don't respect my boundaries, so I'm not going to talk to you anymore, or you don't respect my boundaries, so I'm not going to come over at your house anymore.
But doctor, you also raised a point earlier on that some people think that therapies are very violent, right? Now, we often, as you mentioned, we have our grandparents who witnessed that night when the whole partition thing happened, right? And when we talk to them, so there's this huge family bridge that has occurred. They have their own
Mm.
mindset, we have our own, we want to move forward, they are stuck somewhere. My question is, how do we get to increase more awareness in that generation to say that probably grandma, you need to talk to someone. Therapy is okay, basically. How do we talk to them and get them to bring to someone like you?
So start by sharing resources. For example, there is the 1947 archive in Berkeley. They have done a phenomenal job of collecting 10,000 stories and more from different people all the way from Kabul to Burma. And their videos, their audio recordings, where people talk about their experience and share. It depends on where someone is in terms of their processing, right? Because you can also not force someone to talk about unprocessed trauma that they may be carrying. You have to be very sensitive about it. There can be traumatic responses emotionally, there can be responses physically. A lot of South Asians will describe different aches and pains or different health issues when actually they're talking about a trauma response or an emotional issue. But societally, it's more acceptable to talk about a headache or a stomach ache rather than saying, oh, I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling depressed. So, this is something that is very sensitive. We can't push anyone to change. We can come from a place of compassion, curiosity, and by sharing some of these resources and saying, oh, this person has talked about the partition in this way, in this way. And, people have a lot of different feelings because there's a lot of pride in being a Pakistani, being an Indian, being a Bengali. There's also grief and loss. There's a lot of people who say, oh, the partition shouldn't have happened the way it happened. And history has been written and rewritten about it, what actually happened, who was to blame. You can find so many different books that have all of their own different interpretations and answers. But if our families are staying stuck in a certain mindset or they're staying stuck in their beliefs, we can approach them with love and kindness and understand that it may take several tries. When I've been collecting stories for my upcoming book, The South Asian Guide to Healing Breaking the Cycle of Trauma, which is coming out in 2027, a lot of people took time to open up and speak. And, there were also just interesting differences between genders where, men would talk more, but they didn't quite have the same details that sometimes women would provide. But women would take a little bit longer. They were maybe shy or, there was a
Yeah.
little bit of reluctancy or hesitancy to really speak. But it's so interesting to get their stories. And sometimes they would ask that their children leave before they shared
Mm.
some stories. And so there's a sense where the elderly may not want to share their pain with their children because
Right.
they don't feel comfortable in someone listening to whatever horror that they witnessed or the atrocity that they witnessed. But just like trauma is passed down, resiliency is passed down too. And I have heard stories of incredible courage and kindness during these times too. Hindus hiding Muslim families, Muslims helping Sikhs get across the border safely. I mean, all around there was a lot of violence, but there was also a lot of generosity, compassion. And, even my own grandparents talk very fondly about growing up in these neighborhoods where they celebrated Diwali and they celebrated Eid and they celebrated this. And, everyone kind of
Yeah.
shared resources together. And there wasn't a sense of, oh, they're different. And so we must not speak to them or interact with them.
Wow, I know. This is one side of the spectrum, doctor, where we are trying to get our grandparents or that generation to kind of probably come to terms with what happened. But the next side of the spectrum, or the alternate side, is to raising resilient children, the next generation, who are probably connected to their history but don't feel burdened by it. How can we break that cycle of generational trauma to help them get them where they want to be?
So we carry these burdens, subconsciously also. So
Yeah.
even if we're not aware of it, there may be things. The first part is awareness, right? Just even being aware of our history. And I've talked to some folks who, either their grandparents passed and they didn't know their history, or they were adopted and there's no way to really trace their lineage. But like I said, there are projects, there are resources. There's a Citizens Archive in Pakistan, there's a Partition Museum in India, in Mumbai and Delhi. Like there are these resources where even if you don't know your own personal history, you can read about it, you can learn more, and then you can understand what healing looks like for you. And for me, I think being a psychologist in the West, what I've learned is that I really had to decolonize my practice because not every Western model fits the South Asian family system or our values or our structure. And so healing really has to be kind of an alignment between our mind, our body, and our spirits. And so my book really integrates a lot of holistic practices, which have already been co-opted by the West from our subcontinent. You look at yoga, you look at Ayurvedic practices, you look at all of these different things. They're already there. They're at our disposal. And so we have very rich Hindu, Muslim, Sikh traditions that we can use. We have secular practices that we can use. We can use music, we can use dance, we can use art. All of these things as part of our healing. It doesn't just have to be talk therapy. But when people come to me and they say, okay, how do I get my grandparents into therapy or how do I get my parents into therapy? I always start with this advice: find the common ground. And usually that common ground is, I want us to have a better relationship. I want us to have a way to communicate with each other. Is that something you'd like to work on too? And most people will say yes. So that can sometimes be a soft way to get people into therapy and say, let's talk about this together. And I've seen families where they will bring in their grandparents or parents, and then maybe after a session or two, they're like, this is not for me. That's okay. One of the things that I've tried to do is not necessarily expect people to come in, but I go out to the community so people can see, oh, this is what a psychologist looks like and sounds like, because people have a lot of, different
Yeah.
misinterpretations or information about it. And being able to provide services in their language, I can use the language to explain certain things. So just having different resources. Sometimes, if someone is saying that, oh, they go to their imam for consultation or they talk to their guru, I'll talk to them. Why not? Right? Like we can have these holistic conversations with different people. And it doesn't just have to be so stuck on the individual, because that is the problem with Western psychology, is that only the individual is seen, only the individual is treated, only the individual is seen as the source of the problem and the solution to it.
Yeah, I agree. But this is something that I think cannot be completed in a one-off conversation. This needs to be talked about periodically, Dr. Khalid. But coming to you as an individual, right? The work you do is such a heavy loaded work. You talk to people and you talk through their traumas and pains. On a difficult day, how do you take care of your mental health?
I really love that question because I do have to practice what I preach. And for me, I've been in therapy myself. I've had, a really healthy relationship with a therapist that helped me through a lot of difficult times in my own life. I seek consultation when necessary. Um, I also take care of my physical body because I think for me, being in this profession, I tend to overthink as it is. It's very head heavy. And so I need to be more embodied. And that means that I work out several times a week, or I just breathe, I stretch, I make sure that I eat well, I make sure that I'm hydrated. And I have to be very good about saying no to things. I have to be good about setting my own boundaries and recognizing that if I'm overwhelmed or if I'm not in a good headspace, it's okay to say no. And
Absolutely.
that's been very hard for me. It takes a lot of practice.
It does. Especially, I think if you come from a South Asian family, it is so hard to learn to say no and stick to that no. I know where you're coming from. But, Doctor, if anyone who's listening to this conversation and were to like to reach out to yourself, where can we find you on social media?
So I have a very active Instagram account at Dr. Khalid. You can find me there. You can also find me on my website, riapsychologicalservices.com. I post videos. I post a lot of different information about South Asian family dynamics, on love, attachment, couples relationships, in-law relationships, things about parenting and what it really means to be a good ancestor. And what kind of ancestor do you want to be? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? Whether or not you have children, you can think about the kind of legacy you want to leave behind.
Lovely. That was lovely, Dr. Khalid. And as I said, this can't be a one-off conversation because partition in itself is such a heavily loaded conversation. I think we need to keep coming back at it regularly. But for those of us who have heard this conversation, I really hope that you had a lot to take away from Dr. Khalid's words of wisdom and expertise on how to take care of your trauma. Therapy is not something that you can just shrug under the carpet. It's okay to seek help if you're not feeling up to it. If you want to talk to your family, you want to bridge the gap, just as she mentioned, talk to them softly. Approach the topic in a way that they feel comfortable talking about it. And if you've got any thoughts or questions, please, you can write to me at awaz-e-haqiqat@gmail.com, or you can also reach out to myself on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. On that note, Dr. Khalid, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward probably to having many more such conversations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.